Night had already settled over Washington. Yet the city felt strangely awake. As if the streets themselves were listening. A low winter fog crawled across Constitution Avenue, softening the edges of monuments that usually stood sharp and unshaken. Tonight, even the marble seemed to tremble. Because something had broken loose. Something old. Something buried. Something America was never meant to see again. It began with a leak. Not a headline. Not a rumor. A leak. Quiet, surgical, deliberate. Slipped into the bloodstream of the internet. Like a whisper carrying dynamite. The Epstein File. Long sealed. Long protected. Long dismissed as conspiracy, delusion, or madness. And for years. 4 decades. The powerful slept soundly. Believing those pages would stay cold and hidden. But last night. They didn't. Last night, the first images surfaced online. Grainy, watermarked, half-redacted. Yet unmistakable. You didn't need full clarity to feel the magnitude. A list of visitors. A set of coded entries. A few names blurred. But one name left untouched. A name every American recognizes. Whether they love him, hate him, fear him, or pray he comes back. A name that changed everything. The internet froze. Cable networks stalled. 1,000 political operatives scrambled in the dark. And in that moment, the city seemed to inhale. Trump. Not as a headline. Not as a rumor. But as an entry. Typed, dated, logged. The streets outside the Capitol pulsed with confusion. Like a heartbeat suddenly skipping. Reporters whispered. Aides panicked. Lawyers rehearsed denials before breakfast. But the loudest reaction came from someone who never whispers. A woman forged in chaos. A fighter for her side of the aisle. A storm in human form. The one the world knows simply as Greene. She didn't wait. Didn't hesitate. Didn't check the political weather. Within minutes, her message hit the airwaves. Like a punch thrown without apology. This is a setup. This is war. And America, already shaking, felt itself split again. But beneath the shouting, beneath the social media fires, beneath the fear and fury, there was something quieter. Something more human. Something most of us forget. When the news becomes a battlefield. A question. Who do you believe? When every side claims the truth is on their side. The camera pans slowly across the fog-drenched street. A siren hums in the distance. A streetlight flickers like an exhausted heartbeat. The narrator's voice softens. Yesterday, something happened. No one saw coming. Not because the truth was hidden. But because too many people learned to look away. And now, with one leak, one list, one name unblurred, we're all being asked to look back. Hit subscribe. And tell me, what would you do if your world changed overnight? This story doesn't begin with power. It begins with fear. The kind that sits in your chest. Like a locked room. The kind you pretend not to feel. Until someone forces the door open. Because behind the headlines. Behind the politics. Behind the spectacle. Are people. People shaped by ambition. Scarred by secrets. Driven by promises they couldn't keep. And shadows they couldn't outrun. Let's start with the man whose name shook the country last night. Not the symbol. Not the rally cry. Not the storm that half the nation rides. And half the nation resists. But the person. The boy who grew up learning. That strength meant never showing weakness. That winning mattered more than truth. That the world rewarded those who refused to bend. He didn't become powerful by accident. He was forged. Forged by a machine. Older than any administration. A machine built to elevate some. And erase others. A machine that promised fame. But demanded silence. And silence. In that world. Always cost something. Back then, long before the crowds. Long before the cameras. He learned the oldest lesson in American power. You don't rise alone. Someone opens the door for you. And someone else watches. From the dark. And in that shadowed ecosystem. Of money, influence, favors. And unspeakable bargains. One name kept resurfacing. A name whispered in private jets. In black-tinted SUVs. In rooms where no phones were allowed. And no conscience dared to enter. A financier. A fixer. A gatekeeper of the unthinkable. The man America now knows. As Epstein. The narrator lowers his voice. Like lowering a curtain. He wasn't a monster at first. He was an idea. A promise wrapped in opportunity. A door into rooms. That rewrote destinies. Some entered willingly. Some entered blindly. Some entered thinking. They were the ones in control. But no one leaves a room like that. Untouched. And that's where the story begins. Not in the scandal. Not in the names. Not in the file finally leaking. But in the roots. Because every storm starts with a seed. Every downfall begins with a choice. And every revelation is just a truth. Returning home. The footage flickers. Rows of black SUVs glide across the night. Two agents speak into radios. A woman lights a cigarette. Beneath a parking garage. As if waiting for the world to catch up. And in a small studio. Lined with flags and fury. Greene leans into her microphone. Her voice low. Controlled. Almost trembling. They're trying to take him down. And if you think they'll stop with him, you're not paying attention. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't belong to any side. It doesn't wear a red tie. Or a blue scarf. It doesn't chant at rallies. Or sit in committee rooms. Truth just waits. Waits for the moment. People are finally ready to face it. And tonight, America is standing at the edge of a truth long delayed. The fog thickens. A gust rattles the flag atop the Capitol. Somewhere in the distance, a camera shutter clicks. Like a judge's gavel. And inside millions of homes, ordinary people stare at their screens. Asking themselves a question. That feels heavier than politics. If the system protects the powerful, who protects us? The answer isn't simple. It never has been. Because the systems we build don't just shape the powerful. They shape all of us. They teach us what to fear. What to trust. Who to follow. And who to silently avoid. But every once in a while, a moment arrives. That disrupts the script. A moment when the curtain slips. When the machine misfires. When the truth forces its way to the surface. Whether anyone wants it or not. This leak was that moment. Not the end. Not the verdict. Not the full story. Just the spark. The beginning of a battle. Between what we're told to believe. And what we can no longer ignore. And that's when everything changed. Pause. 5 quiet seconds. The score softens. Because the next part, the part coming now, isn't about politics. It's about humanity. The root. The origin. The truth behind the truth. And that is where we go next. And that was the night America quietly changed. The truth doesn't start on the night it explodes. It starts years earlier. Quiet, unnoticed, tucked into the corners of rooms. Where history pretends not to look. So before the headlines. Before the uproar. Before Greene fired back. And the country split itself open again. We have to step backward. Into the places where power begins. Into the roots. Because no story this big ever starts with a leak. It starts with a person who once believed they still had control. The camera glides over an old photograph. A young man standing in front of a skyline. That looked like a promise. The narrator breathes slowly. He wasn't born the storm. He became it. A boy raised in a world where money spoke louder than honesty. And winning was the only language anyone bothered to teach. He learned early that the world was divided into two kinds of people. Those who made the rules. And those who lived inside them. And he, the boy who would one day walk into arenas filled with roaring crowds, decided he would never be the second kind. But power, real power, doesn't come from ambition alone. It comes from the shadows. From the networks that never appear on maps. From the hands you shake once the cameras turn off. From the rooms where everyone smiles, but no one truly trusts. And in those shadowed corridors, he met a man whose influence was as silent as it was terrifying. A man who had mastered the art of making secrets feel like opportunities. Jeffrey Epstein. Not the monster people now recognize, but the early version. The polished illusion. A man who looked like he understood the world's hidden architecture and was eager to share the blueprint. He approached people gently, almost fatherly, with a quiet charm that made the powerful feel just a little more powerful. His offers always sounded the same. You deserve more access, more connections, more influence. The promises whispered, like invitations, to a world just out of reach. And back then, when ambition still clouded judgment, a younger Trump listened. Not because he trusted Epstein, but because he believed he could use him without being used. A belief shared by dozens. Senators, billionaires, actors, founders. All of them convinced. They were too sharp. Too experienced. Too self-made. To be manipulated. No one ever thinks they're walking into a trap. Until the door clicks. But the root of this story is not the deal they made. It's the belief that made it possible. The belief that the system rewards those bold enough to bend it. That if you play the game hard enough, the consequences won't touch you. That belief is older than politics. Older than any administration. As old as America's hunger. For kings it pretends not to worship. He stood inside those early rooms. Rooms filled with velvet chairs. And glass that looked expensive. Even when it wasn't. And he told himself he was still the one in control. But power has a way of reshaping people. It molds them like wet clay. It builds masks so convincing that sometimes the wearer forgets there's a face underneath. And while Trump grew louder, Epstein grew quieter. Because quiet men, with too much access, are the ones who build systems No one notices until it's too late. The narrator's voice steadies. If you want to understand the explosion, you have to understand the silence. That made it possible. One night, decades ago, Trump walked into a private event. Epstein had arranged. Nothing illegal. Nothing scandalous. Just the kind of gathering where powerful men pretend to relax, while actually measuring one another's influence. The air smelled like old perfume. And sharper intentions. People laughed too loudly. At stories they didn't find funny. A pianist played a song no one was really listening to. And in the middle of it all, Epstein floated. Effortless, elegant. Like a man who held the floor plan to everyone's future. He leaned toward Trump. Offered a handshake. That looked harmless at the time. A handshake that would echo for decades. "You're going far," Epstein said. "And when you do, you'll want people like me making sure the doors stay open." Most people would have heard the warning. He only heard the opportunity. Because that's what ambition does. It blinds. It flatters. It recruits. Trump walked out that night, believing he had gained an ally. He didn't realize what he had actually gained was a shadow. One that would follow him long after Epstein's world collapsed. One that would resurface in a leak 2 decades later and ignite a national wildfire. Now the scene shifts. The camera moves slowly down a hallway lit by a single bulb. Papers scattered on a table. Coffee stains. A pair of black framed glasses set beside a stack of documents. Labeled simply. Visitors, 2002 to 2015. This is the room where the leak began. Not in Congress. Not in a newsroom. Not in a war room buried under Manhattan. But here. In a forgotten corner of an archive that everyone assumed had already been scrubbed clean. The man who found the documents wasn't a whistleblower. He wasn't an activist. Or an enemy. Or a hero. He was a clerk. An exhausted, underpaid clerk. Who didn't even know what he had stumbled into. He opened a folder. Because he was told to relabel it. He turned the page. Paused. Leaned closer. And saw the name. The name that would tear open the political fault lines of America. Like a quake beneath the Capitol. He didn't leak it. He simply reported it. The leak came later. From someone higher. Someone angrier. Someone who realized what this information could do to the country. What it could do to the election. To the narrative. To the tribe lines. America keeps drawing deeper and deeper into the ground. Back in Washington, Greene paces inside her studio. The red light above the camera glows. Her team watches nervously through the glass. She knows what's coming. She knows how quickly the public will weaponize this. She also knows that in politics, truth is rarely the point. Perception is. And perception, in the age of instant outrage, moves faster than fact. She leans into the microphone and speaks with the tone of someone who has learned to live in the fire. They're not after him because of what he did. She says softly. They're after him because of what he represents. Her followers nod. Her critics listen anyway. And somewhere between them, the truth drowns. Because that's what happens when a story grows too big. It stops being a story and becomes a weapon. Epstein knew that. Trump learned that. Greene thrives on that. But the American people? They're still learning. Still trying to understand. Why every scandal feels like another fracture in the country's backbone. Still wondering how much of this was always inevitable. Because roots don't lie. They only grow. And the deeper you dig, the more you discover that the story was never about one leak, one file, or one man. It's about the system that built the stage for all of them. A system that rewards the loudest voices and punishes the quietest truths. A system that convinces good people to make bad choices. Because the path to influence never looks dangerous until you're already halfway through it. And the moment you realize you're trapped, it's too late. The narrator's voice softens. That's the world our central figures inherited. A world designed not for integrity, but for leverage. And in that world, every handshake has a price. Every favor has a shadow. Every ally has a secret. You pray never becomes public. This is the root. The origin. The human beginning. Of a storm America is only now beginning to face. And that's when everything changed. The deeper the root, the darker the truth. Tension never arrives all at once. It slips in quietly. Like a draft beneath a locked door. And in the days after the leak, Washington felt colder. Not because of winter, but because everyone sensed the shift in the air. Power was recalculating. Allies were remeasuring loyalty. And every person with something to lose began rehearsing their version of the truth. The scene opens on a long hallway inside the Capitol. The kind of hallway that carries whispers better than actual voices. Phones buzz. Aides run. Reporters gather in small flocks. Like birds sensing a coming storm. But the loudest sound is silence. That heavy, expectant silence. That settles in right before the sky breaks open. Because everyone is waiting. Not for facts. But for angles. Waiting to see what can be denied. What can be reframed. What can be weaponized. Before the other side gets there first. In America, truth rarely stands alone. It gets escorted, edited, repackaged into something you can sell on cable news. And this leak, it was the kind of truth that made even seasoned operatives feel something close to fear. Not because of what was proven, but because of what it suggested. A crack. A fracture. A breach inside a system that was built to never spill its oldest secrets. The narrator breathes, slow, steady. At first, it looked like progress. Then came the silence. Inside a dimly lit conference room. For senior advisors sit around a table. With legal pads, laptops. And a single question. None of them know how to answer. How do we spin this without making it worse? One of them taps his pen anxiously. Another scrolls through social media. As if searching for a version of the narrative that hasn't collapsed yet. Someone mentions procedural context. Someone else says bold files. Unverified entries. No direct implication. But the truth is simpler. The machine is confused. Because for the first time in years, the battle lines aren't neat. They aren't predictable. They aren't even ideological. They're personal. They're emotional. They're tribal. And tribes don't follow logic. They follow fear. Outside, the protesters gather. Half demanding accountability. Half demanding retaliation. They don't chant the same words. But they shout with the same intensity. That's the thing about political tension in America. Opposites mirror each other. More than they realize. Now the screen cuts. To Greene. Not the politician. Not the performer. But the human being. Alone in her office. She stands by the window. Watching the Capitol glow. Against the dark sky. Her phone lights up every few seconds. Messages from donors. Allies. Handlers. And those who claim to be both. Everyone wants her to speak. To defend. To strike back. To turn the leak into a rallying cry. Before her opponents do. She knows the script. She knows the rhythm. She knows there's power in being first. But tonight, she hesitates. Not from doubt. Not from guilt. But from something deeper. A rare human moment. That even she can't name. Because she understands something. Most people don't. This leak isn't a scandal. It's a signal. A signal that someone is breaking the old rules. Someone with access. Someone with intent. Someone who wants a war. Inside the machine. Instead of outside it. And Greene, for all her fire, knows when she's standing in the middle of a battlefield she didn't choose. Her reflection stares back at her. In the office window. Hard. Focused. Tired in a way that makeup can't hide. When she finally speaks, it's barely a whisper. Who's behind this? It's not a question for her staff. It's not a question for the media. It's a question for the system itself. Because she knows better than most that information of this magnitude never leaks by accident. Someone opened a gate. And someone else is about to walk through it. Meanwhile, the other side of the aisle holds its own meeting. A mirror image of the conference room across town. Different policies. Different priorities. Same fear. Same confusion. Same realization that this leak could tear the country in a direction nobody can predict. They don't trust the file. They don't trust the source. They don't even trust each other. But they trust the opportunity. Play it carefully. One strategist warns. If you go too hard, they'll call it a smear. Another leans forward. And if we don't go hard enough, they'll say we're protecting him. Both are correct. Because that's the tension. No political team can ever escape. You're not playing against your opponent. You're playing against the public's imagination. And imagination moves faster than truth. Across America, ordinary people stare at their phones, trying to make sense of a story that feels too big and too familiar. Some are angry. Some are numb. Some laugh at memes. Because humor is easier than disappointment. But almost all of them feel a question forming in the back of their minds. If this is one name, how many others were hidden? They don't say it out loud. Not yet. But the question hangs in the air. Like static. The narrator whispers. The rules started shifting. Quietly. Invisibly. And then came the contradictions. Trump's camp denies it. Greene attacks the leakers. Opponents demand hearings. Journalists scramble for second sources. Networks cut into programming. With urgent banners that say nothing, but sound like everything. Influencers predict doom. Editorial boards predict justice. Anonymous insiders predict more to come. And somewhere in a newsroom, a young producer slumps in her chair, exhausted by a simple truth. She can't say aloud. None of them know what's actually happening. They're all reacting to the same incomplete spark. Because scandals aren't stories. They're gravity wells. The moment one drops, every orbit changes. And this one pulls hard. Now picture a long corridor. Inside a federal building. A man walks briskly. Coat folded over his arm. Face tense with urgency. He swipes his ID. Enters a secured office. And locks the door behind him. He checks the hall twice. Before pulling a folder from a drawer that was supposed to be sealed. The camera moves in slowly. As he opens it, his jaw tightens. His pulse quickens. There are more names. More visits. More threads. That could unravel the system. Far deeper than anyone outside can imagine. He closes the file. As if afraid it might burn him. He whispers to himself. This can't come out. Not yet. The tension sharpens. Because the truth is no longer about the past. It's about what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. Back in her studio, Greene prepares to go live. Her hair is set. Her notes are stacked. Her expression is steel. But you can hear it. In the second before she speaks. A small, human exhale. That betrays the weight she's carrying. She knows once she starts talking, there's no going back. She knows the words she chooses now will echo across the country. By morning, she knows her supporters are waiting for fire. She knows her critics are waiting for mistakes. She knows this moment will either strengthen her or swallow her. She looks into the camera. Eyes hard. Voice low. And just before she begins, the screen cuts to black. A soft beat. A breath. Then the narrator speaks. The question was never who won, but who decided what winning means. And the silence grew heavier. In politics, fractures rarely appear suddenly. They begin as hairline cracks. Quiet enough to ignore. Visible only to those standing closest to the fault line. And in the early days of Archer's rise, the loudest cheerleader in the room was also the first to sense something was off. Marjorie Talia Gresham, MTG. A firebrand with a style that felt less like a speech and more like an alarm bell. She'd built her career defending Archer with a near-religious intensity, painting him as a warrior chosen to break a rigged system. But something shifted. It started small, a comment here, a hesitation there. Moments where she looked at Archer. Not with admiration, but with confusion, even concern. Because MTG saw what others didn't. The difference between a man fighting a system and a man fighting a shadow only he could see. Behind closed doors, aides whispered about new obsessions. Old enemies resurrected. Patterns that felt familiar. Patterns that made even his allies uneasy. And MTG, the loyal soldier, suddenly found herself asking a question she'd never dared think before. What if the threat isn't outside anymore? That question, unspoken, dangerous, radioactive, was the beginning of the rift. The room didn't erupt. There was no confrontation, no slammed doors, no televised feud. Just a silence. That grew louder. Every week. A silence Archer felt. A silence MTG couldn't shake. A silence that would soon become a storm. History rarely warns us when it changes direction. But on that day, it did. Only 2 people heard it. And neither liked what it meant. Revelation doesn't knock. It arrives like a shadow slipping under a door. Quiet, precise, unavoidable. By now, the leak had moved beyond headlines. It was no longer just a scandal. It was a signal. A map to a world most Americans had been taught never to see. The first reporters who touched it felt the weight immediately. Not the legal weight. Not the political weight. But the human weight. Because behind the file, behind the dates and names, were lives. Lives shaped, broken, and rewritten. Without the public ever knowing. And it became clear, almost instantly, that the story was bigger than Archer. Bigger than MTG. Bigger than any party, any ideology, any narrative. It was the system itself. Being exposed in slow motion. Inside a nondescript office in downtown Manhattan. A young journalist scrolled through the pages. With the reverence of someone touching an artifact that should have been buried forever. She noticed patterns. Repeated flights, repeated meetings, repeated faces. The kind of patterns you can't fake. And can't ignore. A single realization hit her. This wasn't about crimes alone. It was about access. About who got to move in certain rooms. Who could bend laws. Who could survive. And who couldn't. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From comprehension. The system wasn't failing. It wasn't broken. It was designed this way. Meanwhile, in Washington, MTG stared at her own screens. Watching the narrative unfold in real time. Tweets flew like missiles. Cable news anchors shouted over one another. The internet erupted. But she saw something else. Patterns she had been sensing for months. Lines connecting Archer, Epstein, and players long thought untouchable. A web of influence that no one outside the inner circles could have pieced together. And the realization hit her. With the clarity of a winter night. The people calling the shots weren't the politicians. They were the shadows behind them. And the shadows were not indifferent. They were intentional. Archer, for his part, reacted predictably at first. He doubled down publicly. Denying, deflecting, and attacking the leakers with a precision that suggested practice. He played the crowd. Mobilized his base. And turned outrage into energy. But privately, he faltered. Emails, texts, and late-night calls filled his inbox. Each one a reminder. That the world he had built for himself was fragile. Woven out of favors and secrets. That could unravel in an instant. He began to understand something. He had refused to accept for years. Power, when built on shadows, has a life of its own. The narrative fractured further when new entries surfaced. Entries that tied Archer to meetings previously dismissed as trivial or symbolic. But the context was damning. It revealed the rhythm of influence. Who bowed, who bent, who was allowed to rise. MTG, who had always operated on instinct, recognized the danger immediately. It wasn't just Archer under threat. It was everyone orbiting him. Everyone who had ever relied on the same system to protect their rise. The realization created a rift. Not a political one, but a human one. Loyalty collided with conscience. Ambition collided with fear. And that tension, previously invisible, now became impossible to ignore. In the public eye, the leak was chaos. Tweets, op-eds, viral threads. Every news cycle seemed faster than the last. As if the story itself were accelerating toward an inevitable climax. But behind the screens, the human story deepened. Archer faced advisors who whispered truths he didn't want to hear. MTG faced choices she had never imagined she'd have to make. Reporters faced ethical dilemmas that could make or break careers. The system that had protected them was revealing its own architecture. And the architecture was more fragile than anyone realized. The camera moves through empty halls of a historic federal building. Paper rustles. Security cameras hum. A single light flickers overhead. Inside one office, a clerk reopens files he thought long forgotten. Names he had never meant to remember jump off the page. He sees the same connections that reporters and politicians are now tracing. The moment is simple, almost banal. But its impact is seismic. The truth has a way of sneaking into ordinary moments. It arrives quietly, then multiplies, then hits like a hammer. MTG, finally understanding the depth, goes public with a series of statements that are measured but unmistakable. Her voice, calm yet fiery, lays bare the structure of influence she has uncovered. It's not just a defensive maneuver. It's an assertion of clarity in a storm of confusion. And for the first time, Archer listens. Not to defend, not to attack, but to understand that the world has changed, and that the rules he thought he controlled are no longer his to enforce. Across America, ordinary people watch. Some cheer. Some cry. Some sit in stunned silence. Because revelation, when handled with care, doesn't just inform. It transforms. And in the quiet moments, away from cameras and hashtags, people begin to understand. This is how power really works. Not in speeches. Not in votes. Not in promises. But in doors opened and doors closed. Without notice. Without applause. Without accountability. The leak doesn't resolve the system. It doesn't punish everyone responsible. It doesn't restore innocence. But it does something else. It reminds people that the machine has rules beyond visibility. It reminds them that influence is an ecosystem. And that ecosystem is delicate, easily unbalanced by a single truth. And that truth, finally exposed, forces choices. Allies must reconsider loyalty. Enemies must reconsider strategy. Everyone must reconsider the human cost of ambition. By the end of the day, the storm hasn't ended. The fire hasn't burned out. But the veil has lifted. And for Archer, for MTG, for reporters, for clerks, for citizens, the revelation has a quiet, insistent rhythm. The system isn't random. It isn't fair. It isn't indifferent. It's intentional. And now, we all see the gears turning. The truth was never hidden, only waiting. The storm didn't announce itself with lightning or sirens. It arrived in whispers, in surges of attention. In the way a city can feel electric before a blackout. America felt it first in the morning. Notifications pinging endlessly. News alerts flashing on every screen. Social media igniting like kindling. Archer watched from his penthouse. Hands clenched on the marble railing. The city sprawled below him, unaware of the human maelstrom waiting to swallow him whole. And inside that storm, he felt something he rarely allowed himself, fear. Not the fear of losing an election. Not the fear of public opinion. But the fear of exposure. The fear that the machine he had spent decades navigating was finally turning on him. MTG, on the other side, stood by her studio window, watching the news cycle spin faster than she could follow. She felt the momentum building, like a tidal wave beneath the calm surface of politics. Her instincts screamed. The leak was only the first drop. The real deluge was coming. And America, caught in its screens, scrolling, sharing, reacting, felt powerless to stop it. Because the storm is not about the individual. It is about the consequences of living inside a system that rewards audacity and punishes hesitation. Emails poured in. Phone calls rang off the hook. Legal teams debated every move, as strategists drafted statements that might or might not hold under scrutiny. The halls of power became claustrophobic, as every whisper threatened to grow louder than any plan they had ever made. And in that chaos, Archer realized the leaks had done more than expose the past. They exposed him. Not the man the public cheered. Not the icon painted in rallies and banners. The man alone, standing in a room where secrets once felt safe. MTG felt it too. The storm wasn't just outside. It was inside her. A reckoning of loyalty, morality, and ambition. She had spent her life fighting systems that tried to shape her, contain her, define her. Now she had to navigate a storm where every choice could become a weapon, and every ally could become a threat. Her voice, when she finally spoke on air, carried calm intensity. Each word was measured, deliberate. But behind the precision, lurking in every syllable, was the recognition of what was at stake. Humanity itself inside the fight for power. The storm hit hardest in Washington. Capitol corridors, usually echoing only footsteps, were now alive with murmurs, speculation, tension. Politicians moved like chess pieces. Careful, calculating, always anticipating the next strike. And the public? They felt the tremor in their daily lives. Discussions over coffee, in homes, at workplaces, shifted from small talk to questions about morality, trust, and justice. Because storms don't just affect the ones at the center. They ripple outward. They demand choices. They force awareness. They awaken. The first confrontations began quietly. Meetings that had been scheduled for weeks turned into interrogations. Calls for loyalty sounded like accusations. Every statement, every glance, every hesitation became evidence of intent or betrayal. And Archer, used to controlling the narrative, found control slipping like sand through his fingers. The files, the leaks, the sudden transparency were outside his reach. Even his base felt it, their faith tempered by doubt. MTG, watching closely, realized that the storm would not be tamed by words. It demanded action. It demanded clarity. It demanded courage. In the midst of this chaos, ordinary Americans saw themselves reflected. Not in Archer. Not in MTG. But in the fear, the confusion, the moral reckoning. For many, it was a mirror of their own lives. Choices made in the shadows. Decisions that could haunt them. The weight of unseen consequences. Because storms don't discriminate. They touch everyone, whether they know it or not. And then, something unexpected happened. Inside one of the most secure offices in D.C., a clerk, who had spent months compiling documents, decided to speak. Not publicly. Not for headlines. But in a confidential meeting. With someone who could act. He revealed patterns that no one had yet connected. Hidden alliances, financial entanglements, whispered promises. Suddenly, the narrative shifted again. The storm became a hurricane. MTG heard about it immediately. Her pulse quickened. She understood the weight of this revelation. And the power it could unleash. She had to act. And she did, swiftly, decisively, fearlessly. Archer, meanwhile, found himself isolated. His usual networks of support were fractured. Questions he had ignored for years now demanded answers. Every ally weighed the cost of staying loyal. Every opponent smelled opportunity. And above it all, the files waited. Silent. Relentless. Reminding everyone that the past does not remain buried forever. The storm, by now, was everywhere. Newsrooms buzzed. The public screamed online. Analysts dissected every meeting, every tweet, every expression. Lawyers prepared for hearings. Investigators traced connections. And yet, the human cost remained invisible. Behind every document. Behind every allegation. Behind every accusation. Were people grappling with consequences they had never intended. The storm was both external and internal. It demanded not just reaction, but reflection. It forced humanity into the open, under the harshest scrutiny. And then, in a rare quiet moment, Archer sat alone in his office. The storm outside rattled the windows. He stared at the city below. Neon lights hummed softly in the dark. And he realized. You can't buy freedom. You can't legislate fairness. You can only choose who you'll be when everything falls apart. MTG, hours later, sat on the edge of her desk. Reviewing the same files. The weight of knowledge pressed down. She understood, fully, that every action she took now would echo far beyond politics. Beyond her. Into the lives of countless Americans. Who would feel the storm. Long after the headlines faded. The storm reached its peak in the following week. The leak had spread across platforms. Debates raged non-stop. And alliances shifted with each revelation. The country had awakened to the truth of influence. And the magnitude was almost unbearable. But in the eye of the storm, something remarkable happened. A moment of clarity. A pause. A shared recognition among the key players. Humanity matters. Not just power. Not just legacy. Not just optics. And then, silence spoke louder. And then, silence spoke louder. The storm passed. Not with a bang. But with a quiet sense of reckoning. The city exhaled. Windows glimmered in fading neon. Streets emptied as if everyone was holding their breath. Waiting for the world to start again. Archer walked through his penthouse. The weight of weeks pressing on his shoulders. No rally chants. No cameras. Just the hum of the city beneath him. And the knowledge that the world had shifted. While he slept, MTG sat alone in her office. The files still on her desk. But her mind tracing paths. Far beyond the names on the pages. She realized that the fight wasn't over. That history rarely pauses. But that a choice had been made. By everyone who had endured the storm. To see clearly. And to act intentionally. The storm had changed the rules. Not by decree. Not by politics. But by revealing a truth so simple. Yet so elusive. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It must be recognized. It must be claimed. It must be carried forward. Across the country, ordinary people felt the echoes. They shared stories over dinner tables. Reconsidered the trust they placed in power. Relearned the value of accountability. Some wondered if systems would ever be fair. Some realized fairness had never been the point. Some simply felt the weight of knowing that decisions made in private rooms could ripple through lives, with consequences too heavy to ignore. And yet, amid that weight, a spark of hope lingered. The storm had been human, not political. It wasn't about victory or defeat. It was about awareness. About the way people respond when confronted with reality that has been hidden for too long. Archer sat on the balcony. The city lights below like stars trapped on Earth. He thought about choices. He thought about loyalty. He thought about power. But most of all, he thought about responsibility. The kind that cannot be delegated, cannot be bought, cannot be hidden. MTG, meanwhile, looked out of her studio window. The hum of Washington softened into a gentle rhythm. She allowed herself a moment of reflection. The firebrand, the fighter, the politician. They were all there. But also something else. A human being, learning. That courage is not in shouting, but in choosing what's right, when everyone expects you to do otherwise. The files, the leaks, the headlines, the chaos. All of it had passed through human hands. And in passing, had illuminated a universal truth. People can be shaped by the systems they inhabit. But systems themselves are shaped by people who refuse to turn away. There's a lesson in that. For everyone who watched, listened, felt. A young journalist, who had spent nights combing through the documents, sat on the steps outside the office building. The wind carried the city sound softly, almost like applause. Not for her work, but for the human instinct to seek truth even when it frightens. She realized, finally, that her role was not to judge, not to punish, but to illuminate. To let the world see what had been obscured. To remind people that truth survives only when it is told. Archer and MTG would continue to exist in the headlines. They would continue to provoke, to challenge, to inspire fear or admiration. But the real story, the story that mattered most, was the one beneath the spectacle. The story of choices. The story of humanity. The story of seeing what is hidden. And deciding, despite consequences, to do what must be done. Because freedom isn't given. It isn't promised. It is passed down. One brave choice at a time. The city sleeps. The fog rolls back. The neon lights hum softly above avenues that witnessed chaos and survived to see clarity. Somewhere, in a quiet room, Greene writes her notes. Archer contemplates his reflection. Journalists prepare tomorrow's headlines. And ordinary people think, for the first time in a long while, about the power of awareness. It is a fragile gift. It is fleeting. But it is ours. As long as we choose to see it. The final scene drifts slowly over the Capitol dome. Its silhouette etched against the morning sky. A few clouds linger, but the sun peeks through, casting long, golden rays over a city that has learned to witness its own reflection. And in that light, the lesson is simple, quiet, and profound. The storm will come again. The shadows will gather again. The secrets will not stay buried. But courage, awareness, humanity, these can endure. And when your moment comes, you will know what you stand for. The narrator lowers his voice to a whisper, almost intimate. And maybe that's how it all begins again. And maybe that's how it all begins again. The storm had passed. But the city, the country, the people, They were still trembling. The immediate fury of headlines was gone, replaced by a quieter reckoning. Questions lingered, heavier than ever. Who knew? Who allowed it? And perhaps most haunting, who, in the end, had really been in control? Archer walked the halls of his office. Past empty conference rooms. Past framed photographs of victories that now felt oddly distant. He could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. And the subtle tick of clocks that measured time. He had once believed he could bend. Even the walls seemed to watch him. Every shadow carried memory. Every corner, a whisper of what had been. And what might still come. Because after storms, there is always the reckoning. MTG, meanwhile, moved like a strategist through the corridors of power. But there was something different now in her posture. A quiet gravity. She no longer spoke merely to rally or to fight. She spoke to illuminate. Her words, her statements, her public appearances carried the weight of lessons learned. From the leak, from the files, from the shadowed corridors that had once seemed invincible. People listened differently. Not because she was louder. Not because she shouted harder. But because she had seen behind the curtain. And now, so had they. Across America, the public grappled with the aftershocks. Some felt betrayed. Some felt awakened. Some felt both. In coffee shops, families debated the ethics of power. In classrooms, teachers framed history in shades far more complicated than textbooks had allowed. Online, millions scrolled, read, shared, argued. But beneath the noise was a shared understanding. The world had shifted. Even if no one could yet name how. A young journalist, still processing the scope of the files, sat on a rooftop in the city that never slept. She gazed at the skyline, reflecting on the lives behind every headline. The human cost was invisible. But it mattered. It always did. She realized the truth. Stories are not just about who wins. Or who loses. But about who chooses to see. Who chooses to act. And who chooses to carry the weight. When the world turns its eyes away, the legal ramifications began to unfold slowly. Subpoenas, hearings, investigations. But even as the machinery of accountability creaked into motion, the human lessons persisted. Power thrives in shadows. Ambition thrives in noise. But awareness, human awareness, is the only thing that can break cycles. Even momentarily. And for MTG, Archer, and every other player, those lessons were not abstract. They were immediate. They were personal. A scene shifts to the quiet streets of a small town. Thousands of miles from the centers of power. People there feel the ripples. Even if they cannot see the storm itself. Conversations carry new weight. Decisions feel different. A single teacher pauses, thinking. Even the smallest choices shape the world. And she is right. Because after storms like this, everything becomes connected. Every act of honesty. Every brave question. Every human choice. It reverberates. Archer, sitting in his study late one night, reflects on the files, the fallout, the faces of those affected. It is not victory he seeks. Nor vindication. It is clarity. And in that clarity, he recognizes his own vulnerability. The fragility of influence. The weight of trust once taken for granted. MTG, in parallel, prepares her next public address. She writes not to provoke, but to explain. To shine a light on shadows most had long accepted as untouchable. Her words are precise, careful, and deliberate. And yet, they carry a human warmth. that reaches beyond politics. The camera glides over empty Capitol corridors. The hum of fluorescent lights echoes softly. Files are filed. Phones are silenced. The frenzy slows. And in the stillness, reflection grows. It's here, in the calm, that humanity matters most. Not in rallies. Not in headlines. Not in viral clips. But in choices, small, measured, meaningful. Because every system, no matter how entrenched, can be nudged, shaped, reformed, by those who refuse to look away. The story of the files, the leaks, the storm, and the confrontation between Archer and MTG does not end in courtrooms or headlines. It ends in human awareness. In the quiet understanding that history is built not just by power, but by conscience. The storm illuminated the fragility of ambition, the limits of influence, and the enduring necessity of courage. And in that illumination, ordinary people learned something extraordinary. The world is never beyond their reach, as long as they choose to see. Archer steps onto his balcony one final time. The city stretches before him. Soft lights glowing like embers of a day past. He exhales. He has survived, yes. But he has also learned that survival alone is never enough. MTG watches the same sunset from her studio window, allowing the quiet to sink in. She recognizes the power of reflection, the gift of hindsight, and the responsibility to act with clarity and humanity. Somewhere in the city, the clerk who found the files walks home slowly, feeling the weight of what he has done. Ordinary, quiet, yet pivotal. The storm may fade from headlines, but its echoes live in choices made by people no one notices. And in every home, every office, every street, Americans begin to grasp the lesson that the storm demanded they understand. Power is seductive. Ambition is blinding. But human courage, that delicate, fragile, ordinary force, can shape history. If we are willing to see, to act, and to bear the consequences. The narrator's voice softens. The city hums quietly below. And he speaks, almost whispering. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It isn't promised. It is passed down. One brave choice at a time. And in that quiet, reflective light, the story comes full circle. And perhaps, that is where it all begins again. The storm had quieted. But its tremors were still moving through the streets, the screens, the lives of Americans. Headlines no longer screamed. But the questions they left behind echoed in living rooms, coffee shops, classrooms, and offices. The country had glimpsed the machinery of influence. And it could not look away. Archer retreated briefly from the public eye. Not out of shame, but out of calculation. He walked through empty halls of his properties. The walls lined with portraits of himself. And reminders of battles won. But the victories felt hollow now. Because he had seen the shadow play. How the system bends, how secrets live. And how fragile even the most powerful illusion can be. He began to think differently about loyalty. About alliances. About the consequences of ambition. For the first time, he realized that influence isn't a weapon. It's a responsibility. MTG, in contrast, stepped forward. Her public statements measured, deliberate, piercing. She spoke not to inflame. Not to rally. But to illuminate. She articulated the hidden rules she had discovered. The subtle architecture of power. That had allowed certain truths to remain buried for so long. Her voice, calm yet unwavering, reached not only those who supported her, but those who opposed her. Forcing everyone to reckon with the human cost of the system. The cultural reverberations were profound. Talk shows, podcasts, viral threads. All were flooded with discussions about accountability, transparency, and ethics. The story became a lens through which Americans questioned institutions, power structures, and even themselves. Parents explained the leaks to their children as examples of integrity and courage. Teachers used them as lessons in ethics and history. Workers debated them over lunch breaks, weighing ambition against morality, loyalty against conscience. Because the storm wasn't just political, it was human. It asked the same questions we all must answer. When will you act? When will you speak? When will you refuse to look away? Inside the halls of power, repercussions unfolded slowly. Some aides and allies shifted loyalties. Some former friends quietly distanced themselves. Investigators followed leads. Legislators proposed reforms. And journalists worked nights to trace every ripple, to map every hidden connection. The files had exposed more than scandal. They exposed a pattern, a rhythm, a way of life that many had taken for granted. And now, the country could see it, could talk about it, could demand change. Meanwhile, Archer confronted his own reflection. The files, the fallout, the public eye, it had forced him to recognize that the persona he built was never the full measure of him. He understood the duality of influence. It creates opportunity, but it also imposes moral reckoning. And in that quiet self-confrontation, he felt something rare. Not fear, not anger, but responsibility. A recognition that survival alone was not enough. That legacy required conscience. MTG felt a similar weight. The storm had confirmed her instincts. The system was deeper, more intricate, and more fragile than most realized. But she also recognized an opportunity to shape the conversation, to shift culture toward accountability, without becoming the monster the system often rewarded. Her power now lay in clarity, in her ability to see, and to act deliberately, even when consequences were uncertain. Across America, ordinary citizens felt the ripples. Social media campaigns ignited debates. Communities held forums. Educators created curriculums based on the revelations. Even small towns, far from power corridors, experienced a quiet awakening. The recognition that information, once revealed, changes behavior. And that understanding the hidden rules can shape the choices you make. Every single day. Some laughed at the absurdity. Some cried at the injustice. Some silently reflected. All were transformed, even slightly, by a story that reached beyond politics and into the heart of humanity. In the media, a subtle shift occurred. Journalists pursued the story differently now, emphasizing not sensationalism, but depth, context, and human consequence. The narrative moved from personalities to systems, from spectacle to scrutiny, and from division to reflection. The country, for a brief moment, was learning how to think about power differently. Archer, MTG, the journalists, the clerks, the ordinary Americans who followed the story, all became part of a living ecosystem of consequence, action, and reflection. The files had acted as a catalyst, revealing not only the past, but the potential of a more aware society. The lessons were simple, yet profound. Truth persists. Shadows can be illuminated. Choice is inevitable. And courage, ordinary human courage, can ripple farther than any strategy, any campaign, any headline. In the quiet aftermath, The world wasn't perfect. Systems still bent. Ambition still clashed. And power remained seductive. But there was clarity. There was understanding. And there was hope. Because after storms, when the debris settles, the people who remain are those who have seen the truth, and who are willing to carry it forward. The narrator lowers his voice, calm and reflective. The storm changes everything. But it also teaches everything. It reminds us that history is made not only by what we see, but by what we choose to recognize. And that recognition is the first light of accountability. And that light begins in each of us. Not everyone saw the storm on screens. Not everyone read the headlines. But everyone felt its echoes in ways small, quiet, and impossible to ignore. A single mother in Ohio sat at her kitchen table. The television flickering in the background. Her children laughed at a cartoon, oblivious to the ripple spreading through the world outside. She stared at the screen, digesting the names, the files, the patterns. Her first thought, how could this happen? Her second, how do I explain it to them? And she realized something essential. Truth is not just in what is revealed, it is in what we choose to pass on. A high school teacher in Kansas paused his lesson. Slides on the projector frozen mid-sentence. The files, the leak, the revelations, they demanded a new discussion. Ethics, power, choice, he traced these concepts back to the history curriculum. He asked his students, when you face a decision no one else will see, what guides you? Fear? Loyalty? Or conscience? The room was silent. But in that silence, a lesson was unfolding. Far deeper than any textbook could teach. Meanwhile, in a small newsroom in Manhattan, a young journalist, already weary from weeks of chasing leads, found herself staring at the same names over and over. Each story, each connection, was a life shaped, a choice imposed, a trust broken. Her editor urged her to sensationalize, to chase clicks, to drive outrage. She refused. Because she understood something vital. The human cost of truth is not in the revelation alone, but in the careful attention to consequence. She typed slowly, deliberately, letting the words breathe, letting the story honor the lives it touched. Archer, in private moments, faced a different reckoning. He had always understood power as a game. Wins, losses, influence, loyalty. All measurable, quantifiable, conquerable. But now he felt the weight of human fragility. The files reminded him of faces he had overlooked. The unintended consequences of every maneuver. The lives intersected by choices made behind closed doors. He saw fear, regret, and confusion. Not in the media, but in himself. And he realized. The storm had been more than external. It had revealed the human cost of his own ambition. MTG, too, wrestled with her humanity. The firebrand, the strategist, the loyalist, all were present. But beneath them was something deeper. A reckoning with conscience. She had spoken publicly. Illuminated truths, held people accountable. But she could not ignore the quiet suffering of innocence. The families, the employees, the bystanders. Her power was political. But her responsibility was human. And in that duality, she learned the weight of choice. In D.C., a clerk quietly reviewed documents that had once seemed mundane. He had no platform, no fame, no agenda. Yet his diligence had contributed to revelation. Each line of a file, each record reviewed, was a quiet act of courage. He understood that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the margins, shows up in small acts, and changes the course of events. Without recognition. Across the country, ordinary Americans absorbed the story differently. Some felt outrage. Some felt betrayal. Some felt awakening. But nearly all confronted a subtle truth. The systems they lived within were neither neutral nor invisible. The choices of the powerful touch everyone. And every human has a responsibility to observe, question, and act. Even the media ecosystem changed. Journalists began asking harder questions. Editorial boards debated not only strategy, but the ethics of coverage. And for the first time, a broader conversation emerged. How do we balance transparency with humanity? Truth with consequence. And exposure with care. The storm had exposed power. But it had also exposed something more essential. Human nature. Fear, loyalty, greed, courage, conscience, all collided. In every person touched by the files. Some faltered. Some rose. And the choices made in those collisions would echo long after headlines faded. In quiet moments, the lessons of the files lingered. A daughter asking her father why the world seems unfair. A teacher pressing students to think critically, not just memorize. A journalist rewriting a story to honor truth over spectacle. A politician questioning the limits of influence. A clerk realizing the significance of small acts. Humanity, it seemed, was the ultimate revelation. Archer, alone in his study, finally understood what many would never learn. Power is transient. Ambition is dangerous. But conscience, human conscience, is eternal. MTG, gazing out over the city, reflected on a similar truth. True courage isn't in headlines or rallies. It's in the decisions we make when no one is watching. When fear beckons. When loyalty conflicts with conscience. And in that quiet reflection, both realized a profound paradox. The storm had destroyed illusions. But it had revealed clarity. The narrator's voice softens, cinematic, almost intimate. The files, the leaks, the storm, they were more than politics. They were mirrors. They reflected ambition, fear, loyalty, and courage. Back to everyone willing to see. And in that reflection, we discover not only the truth about the system, but the truth about ourselves. And sometimes, seeing is the first act of courage. Even after the storm, the game of influence continued. Not in headlines. Not in rallies. But in quiet rooms, behind closed doors. Where decisions were made that would ripple across lives. Alliances shifted. Loyalty faltered. And every player realized the rules had changed. Whether they admitted it or not. Archer convened his closest advisors in a dimly lit boardroom. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Every glance, every half-smile, every pause was a negotiation of survival. He spoke, measured but forceful. We've weathered the storm, but storms leave cracks. And cracks can swallow empires if ignored. A young strategist, ambitious but cautious, suggested recalibrating alliances. Reframing the narrative. And rebuilding influence piece by piece. But Archer, silent for a moment, understood something deeper. This was no longer about strategy alone. It was about trust. The human bonds that once cemented his power were fraying. And no strategy could fully restore them. Meanwhile, MTG approached the situation differently. She convened her own circle. Not to intimidate or command, but to clarify. To examine the moral and practical landscape left in the storm's wake. Her questions were sharp, precise. Who can we rely on? Who can we trust with truth? Who will act responsibly when choices matter most? Her team felt the weight of her scrutiny. Some crumbled under it. Some rose. And in that crucible, alliances were reforged, not by convenience, but by shared understanding of human accountability. The broader political ecosystem also shifted. Opponents saw openings, yes. But they also recognized the fragility of influence. The files had reminded everyone that power is never absolute. That ambition without conscience is a liability. And that every choice carries consequences unseen. And so, even as parties regrouped, the dynamics had changed forever. A new kind of calculation had entered the game. Not just who can win, but who can endure ethically. Archer, feeling the fractures, found himself reassessing old alliances. Some were opportunistic. Some were loyal. Some had survived the storm unscathed. But would they stand when the next wave came? He understood that influence is a living organism, responding to pressure, opportunity, and human choices. And for the first time, he feared not political defeat, but the loss of moral footing. MTG, in parallel, realized that her role was not to punish, but to stabilize, to guide alliances toward clarity, and to illuminate paths that avoided unnecessary human harm. Her approach was subtle, deliberate, and strategic. A balancing act between principle and pragmatism. And in her approach, she discovered something vital. True power lies not just in commanding influence, but in shaping the ethical compass of those who wield it. In backrooms, private offices, and quiet dining rooms, negotiations unfolded with a human intensity unseen by the public. Alliances were tested. Promises were reconsidered. And even friendships were measured in the balance of conscience. Because after a storm like this, alliances aren't just political, they are human. They are built on trust, accountability, and shared recognition of the consequences that power imposes. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens watched the aftermath unfold with a mix of awe and apprehension. They debated not just the files or the leaks, but the very meaning of responsibility. They saw that those in power are human, fallible, and accountable. And that accountability is not just a legal concept, but a moral one. The storm had given them a lens. And through that lens, every choice, every alliance, every act of courage or cowardice was suddenly visible. Even in the quietest corners, human stories emerged. A clerk who had risked exposure felt pride mingled with fear. A journalist who chose integrity over sensationalism experienced both exhaustion and satisfaction. A teacher who guided students through complex moral questions sensed the awakening of critical consciousness. Every action, no matter how small, contributed to a larger ecosystem, shaped by awareness and human decision. The files had not simply revealed scandal. They had revealed human truth. And truth, once recognized, demands reckoning. Even the most strategic maneuvers, the most calculated moves, cannot escape its reach. Archer, watching these dynamics unfold, recognized the paradox of power. It can inspire loyalty, achieve goals, and command attention. Yet it can never shield the human soul from reflection, conscience, or consequence. MTG, observing from her vantage, understood the complement of that paradox. Power is also an opportunity to shape the moral architecture of the alliances you build, to guide human decisions toward responsibility, clarity, and integrity. The storm had reshaped more than headlines. It had reshaped people, relationships, and expectations. Alliances were no longer purely tactical. They were human, fragile, resilient, ethical. And the decisions made in this crucible would echo far beyond politics. They would influence lives, values, and culture in ways no one could fully predict. The narrator's voice softens, measured, almost meditative. The storm reveals the cracks in systems. But it also reveals the humanity behind them. Alliances are more than strategy, they are reflections of conscience. And every decision made in their formation carries weight far beyond the room in which it is made. And every choice leaves its own shadow. The storm had passed. But its echoes lingered in the quietest moments. Archer sat alone in his study. The city lights below flickering like distant stars. No cameras. No applause. Just him. The weight of choices. And the realization that power is never absolute. He thought of the files. The leaked truths. The lives unknowingly affected. For decades, he had operated in a world where influence was currency. And loyalty was measured in proximity. But now, stripped of spectacle, he faced something far heavier, conscience. He remembered each decision. Each compromise, each overlooked consequence. The victories he had once celebrated felt hollow. Because the human cost, unseen, uncounted, undeniable, weighed more than any headline. MTG, in contrast, felt a different kind of reckoning. The files had confirmed her instincts. But they had also revealed the fragility of human loyalty. She had acted, she had exposed, she had illuminated. But in the quiet, she wrestled with consequences she could not control. A staffer she trusted had faltered. A friend had misjudged a risk. An innocent bystander had been swept into the storm. Her power, once intoxicating, now felt like a burden. Every choice carried ripples far beyond her vision. And yet, she understood, responsibility cannot be deferred. It must be embraced, however imperfectly. Elsewhere, the clerk who discovered the critical files walked home under the soft glow of streetlights. He thought about anonymity, about courage. About the small acts that shape history. No one would know his name. No one would celebrate his contribution. And yet, he felt the quiet triumph. That comes from doing what is right. When no one is watching. The young journalist, exhausted but resolute, stared at her screen one final time that night. She reflected on what she had uncovered. On the stories she had chosen to tell. And on the ethical line she had walked. She had been tempted by spectacle. By sensationalism, by the easy click. But she had resisted. And in that resistance, she realized something profound. Truth is not just a story to be told, it is a responsibility. To every life it touches. Across the country, ordinary Americans grappled with their own reckonings. The storm had revealed systems of power, yes. But it had also revealed human nature. It asked them, what do you stand for when no one is watching? How do you act when loyalty conflicts with conscience? And what do you do when the cost of integrity feels unbearable? Some found clarity. Some felt unease. All were confronted with the quiet weight of human choice. Archer returned to the files late at night, poring over details he had once ignored. He realized that power without reflection is hollow. Ambition without conscience is dangerous. And influence without responsibility is merely illusion. He understood that his legacy would not be measured by victories, rallies, or headlines. It would be measured by the lives he touched and the ethical choices he made in moments of crisis. MTG, too, faced the stark reality of personal consequence. Her decisions had reshaped alliances, exposed truths, and disrupted lives. Some celebrated her courage. Some criticized her judgment. But she could not retreat into convenience. She could not hide behind rhetoric or spectacle. Her reckoning was quiet, moral, human. She knew the world would continue to judge. And yet, she found a strange clarity. Integrity is measured not by applause, but by the courage to act rightly. In the shadows, the storm had left marks on everyone it touched. Even those far from politics, far from the files, felt its quiet moral pull. A teacher corrected a lesson plan. A father reconsidered how he taught ethics at home. A student wrestled with honesty on a test. The files, the leaks, the storm, they had become a mirror. And in that reflection, humanity confronted itself. The narrator's voice softens, reflective, intimate. The true reckoning of power is not in headlines or courtrooms. It is in the quiet reflection of choices made. In the courage to act ethically when convenience whispers otherwise. And in the understanding that every decision touches lives unseen. And sometimes, the greatest storms are the ones that rage quietly inside us. And in the quiet, we find ourselves. The storm had passed. But it left a city, and a nation, awake in ways they had not been before. The files revealed more than names or scandals. They revealed a system. An architecture of power. Deliberately opaque. Deliberately maintained. And quietly self-perpetuating. Archer watched from his office window. The streets below quiet but alive. He understood, now more clearly than ever. That power is rarely personal. It is structural. It exists in layers. In agreements whispered in hallways. In decisions made long before anyone notices. The files had illuminated those layers. And for the first time, he felt both admiration and fear. For the invisible machinery he had navigated. Without fully understanding its consequences. MTG approached the systemic revelations differently. She traced connections, patterns, incentives. She noted the invisible wires linking offices, politicians, advisors, and institutions. What appeared chaotic on the surface was, in fact, meticulously ordered beneath. She realized the storm had exposed something critical. Institutions do not fail by accident. They fail because they are designed to serve themselves first. And humanity second. And yet, that understanding offered a path forward. To act within systems. To illuminate their mechanics. And to nudge them toward accountability. Across Washington, analysts and bureaucrats quietly digested the fallout. Reports were rewritten, procedures re-examined. And oversight committees began to trace connections. Previously hidden in plain sight. But even as the machinery hummed, the human element remained unpredictable. Courage, integrity, fear, ambition. These forces could not be systematized. They moved like wine through the gears. Sometimes clearing paths, sometimes blocking them. The files had also revealed the fragility of secrecy. One clerical error, one overlooked memo. One conscientious individual. And the hidden architecture of power could unravel. Archer reflected on this truth. The system had protected him. Enabled him, elevated him. But it was not invincible. And the fragility he had once exploited was now staring back at him. MTG, tracing the same threads from her perspective, understood the strategic advantage the storm had created. Not in politics. Not in headlines. But in exposing the very levers of influence. She could now anticipate, intervene, and guide. But with that advantage came responsibility. Systems are not merely tools, they are reflections of collective human choices. And to manipulate them without ethics is to betray humanity itself. Outside of power corridors, ordinary citizens began noticing the ripples. Educators adjusted lessons to include systemic ethics. Students debated not just morality, but the architecture of authority. Communities held forums exploring accountability, transparency, and civic engagement. The files had done more than shock, they had educated. illuminating patterns that had existed in silence for decades. Even the media ecosystem evolved. Journalists who had chased clicks shifted focus. Investigative reporters now sought context, not sensation. They began mapping networks of influence, showing how personal ambition, institutional design, and moral choices intertwined. The story was no longer about individual power, it was about how power operates, and how human decisions shape it. Archer, reflecting late one night, realized the irony. Systems designed to protect secrecy now amplified transparency. Those who understood the structures best could choose to reinforce accountability or exploit the gaps. The files had democratized insight, making even those outside power corridors capable of understanding and influencing the system. MTG, in a quiet office, penned notes for a strategy session. Her objective was no longer simply victory. It was stability. It was ethical stewardship. She understood that while systems can be manipulated, they can also be guided toward fairness, if approached with clarity, courage, and human insight. Her work was painstaking, slow, often invisible. But she knew the stakes were higher than politics. The integrity of the system, and the lives it touches, depended on it. Even Archer felt the weight of systemic awareness. No longer was he simply a player in the storm. He was now also a witness. Aware that every move, every decision, every alliance, every maneuver resonated far beyond his control. He began to question what it truly meant to wield power responsibly, to navigate influence without succumbing to its corrosive temptations. The storm had revealed more than scandal. It revealed architecture. Invisible levers, hidden wires, quiet rules that governed lives silently. And it showed that when human choices intersect with these structures, the impact is profound, unpredictable, and lasting. The files had democratized insight, exposing how the system works, and illuminating the fragile, human choices at every level. The narrator's voice grows reflective, calm, almost intimate. Power is not just who sits at the top. It is a network of human choices, a system of incentives, and a mirror of our collective morality. The storm revealed this not with fireworks, but with quiet clarity. And clarity can be the beginning of change. The storm had passed, but it left a culture unsettled, scratching at truths it had long avoided. Across America, conversations shifted. No longer just about politics, but about values, ethics, and the invisible threads that tie individual choices to collective consequences. In living rooms, families debated morality. Parents explained to children why some adults act wrongly, why institutions fail, and why courage is rarely loud. In classrooms, teachers paused their lessons, tracing the flow of influence, ethics, and consequence. Students asked questions not to get answers, but to understand the mechanisms behind power. Even in small towns, the whispers carried weight. Neighbors talked about integrity, about accountability, about the cost of silence. The files had democratized reflection. The revelations forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths. Power is seductive. Ambition is dangerous. And accountability is often invisible. But it is never optional. Cultural norms began to shift. The applause for spectacle faded. Respect grew for transparency, for integrity, for the courage to act ethically when no one is watching. Archer observed these ripples with quiet astonishment. The storm had been tactical, political, calculated. But its cultural impact, the way it reshaped conversations, behaviors, expectations, was beyond any strategy. He realized that influence, once wielded, cannot be contained. It spreads through society, nudging values, challenging assumptions, and prompting reflection in ways unseen by headlines. MTG saw it too. Her strategy, her revelations, her exposure of hidden structures had catalyzed more than political awareness. It had created a moral mirror. Communities now debated questions that had been abstract. What is the cost of loyalty? When does compliance become complicity? How do we measure courage? And when is silence the most dangerous choice? The files had sparked a quiet revolution. Not of votes, but of conscience. Even popular culture absorbed the storm's energy. Television shows and podcasts explored ethics in new ways. Comedians, once careless in their commentary, began highlighting human responsibility. Songs and art reflected societal tension, turning scandal into introspection. Every medium, every outlet, carried echoes of the storm, forcing audiences to reflect on their own choices, their own complicity, their own courage. Ordinary Americans began applying lessons in subtle ways. A manager questioned a long-standing workplace norm. A teacher designed a new curriculum emphasizing critical thinking. A voter researched not just candidates, but the integrity of institutions and policies. The storm had been political, yes. But its cultural imprint was human. It reshaped expectations, raised the bar for accountability, and reminded society that ethics is never passive. Even media coverage evolved. Reporters moved beyond headlines and personalities, exploring systemic consequences, human choices, and moral responsibility. Public discourse shifted from outrage to reflection, from spectacle to substance. And in those subtle shifts, a new culture of accountability began to emerge. Archer, for all his power, understood something humbling. Culture is not controlled by strategy. It is influenced by visibility, by choices, by courage. No single person can dictate it. It flows, unpredictable, human, resilient. MTG, observing, recognized a similar truth. The most potent influence is not domination or fear, but the subtle shaping of conscience, the illumination of what is hidden, and the quiet insistence that integrity matters. The storm had not ended. Its headlines faded, but its questions persisted. How do we act when the system is flawed? When loyalty conflicts with conscience? When silence feels safest? And the answers were not simple. They required reflection, courage, and human discernment. Across the country, citizens internalized the reckoning. They were no longer passive observers. They questioned leaders, institutions, and themselves. They debated morality as a civic responsibility. They understood that accountability begins with awareness. The cultural shift was subtle, but real. And history would remember it. Not in viral clips, but in changed behaviors. In conversations that lingered. In a society awakened to the weight of human choices. The narrator's voice softens, reflective, cinematic. The storm did not merely expose power. It exposed conscience. It revealed the fragile architecture of trust, and the extraordinary impact of ordinary choices. Culture, once passive, had awoken. And in that awakening, there was both responsibility and hope. And hope begins in the questions we dare to ask. The storm had moved on. But its consequences lingered, invisible yet undeniable. Not every effect made headlines. Not every consequence was celebrated. Some were subtle, quiet. Slipping into the corners of lives, shaping decisions. Changing trajectories without anyone noticing. Archer felt it first in the private corridors of his influence. Old allies hesitated. Conversations that had once been routine now carried an unspoken caution. Even minor decisions seemed weighted with unseen eyes. He realized the storm had changed perception. Even among those who had once been loyal. Trust, once assumed, now required proof. And proof, Archer discovered, is fragile. Because human memory, and human judgment, never forgets a breach of conscience. MTG experienced hidden consequences too. Her public victories carried personal costs. Strained relationships, private scrutiny, whispered doubts. She had illuminated truths. But she had also disrupted lives. Some colleagues grew distant. Some opponents learned lessons they would carry quietly. Reshaping future strategies in ways she could not predict. The files had not just exposed corruption, they had altered behavior. Often subtly, often in places no one could track. In small offices and public institutions. Clerks, administrators, and junior staff discovered their own stakes. One clerk who had once thought himself inconsequential found that his attention to detail had prevented further harm. Another, who had ignored a warning, realized that silence carries consequences. Even decades later. Every human action, deliberate or negligent, had the potential to ripple outward. Like waves in water. Long after the storm had passed. Across the country, families grappled with moral dilemmas exposed by the files. Parents explained responsibility to children. Teachers debated ethics with students. Neighbors discussed accountability over dinner tables. The lessons were clear. Even if unspoken. Human choices resonate. Ethics are never passive. And consequences, often hidden, are always real. The media ecosystem, too, felt the subtle weight of the storm. Reporters reflected on past practices. Editors questioned the long-term impact of sensationalism. Podcasts and documentaries emerged, exploring systemic ethics and human responsibility. Even the seemingly small decisions, what to report, what to emphasize, what to withhold, were influenced by the storm's lingering shadow. Journalistic integrity had been tested. And now, subtly, it was reshaping the profession itself. Archer, confronted with these ripples, understood the paradox of influence. The more visible the storm, the more invisible its consequences. Every decision, every maneuver, every compromise or oversight, echoed silently across the human landscape. And while he could anticipate headlines, he could not control the quiet shifts in perception, behavior, or morality. MTG recognized a similar paradox. Success, exposure, victory, all carried unseen burdens. Every revelation reshaped not only public perception, but private relationships, institutional habits, and personal reputations. Power, she realized, is never simply about action, it is about effect. And the most profound effects are often those that go unnoticed. Even ordinary citizens experienced hidden consequences. A student who had questioned authority in class carried that courage into adulthood. A worker who challenged a policy quietly influenced future decisions in ways that no one measured. Small acts, imperceptible at the time, reverberated outward, shaping culture, ethics, and society itself. The storm had created a lattice of consequence, connecting people, choices, and outcomes in ways no single player could fully anticipate. In the quiet of his study, Archer reflected on his own trajectory. He realized the files had exposed him to scrutiny. But they had also illuminated human truth. The hidden consequences of ambition, power, and inaction were now impossible to ignore. He felt a mixture of fear, regret, and clarity. Fear of what might still ripple outward. Regret for choices that caused harm. And clarity about the moral dimension of influence. MTG, reviewing her strategy notes, recognized that she too was part of an unseen network of consequences. Her public actions had been deliberate. But their echoes moved in directions even she could not fully predict. The storm had taught her the necessity of ethical foresight. To anticipate the impact of human decisions beyond immediate visibility. Even as she celebrated victories, she respected the unseen weight of every choice. The files, the storm, the leaks, they had left a legacy of awareness. Not every consequence was public. Not every impact could be measured. But the sum of human choice, ethics, and courage had been shifted. And in that shift, the future, though uncertain, held the possibility of change. The narrator's voice softens, reflective, cinematic. The storm does not end when the headlines fade. It lingers in choices, relationships, institutions, and conscience. Its consequences are not always visible. But they are inevitable. And those who recognize them, who act with awareness, carry the quiet power to reshape the world. And the ripples reach farther than we see. The storm had passed. But the world it touched did not return to the old rhythm. Not entirely. There was a subtle shift. A quiet awakening that moved through classrooms, offices, neighborhoods, and homes. It was invisible, almost imperceptible. But it carried weight. In a small town in Pennsylvania, a local teacher paused her lesson mid-sentence. The files had sparked debates. And she felt compelled to bring the conversation home. She asked her students, "What does integrity look like when no one is watching? How do you act when it costs you nothing, or everything?" The room was still. The weight of responsibility filled the air. And for some, that pause changed the trajectory of thought. The path of conscience. The rhythm of decision-making. A journalist in Chicago, long weary of sensationalism, picked up the pen with renewed purpose. She had witnessed the storm. Seen the files, felt the human cost. Her stories shifted, less flash, more context. Less spectacle, more understanding. She realized that journalism's highest calling was not to expose, but to illuminate. To reveal not just corruption, but human choice, consequence, and courage. And in doing so, she ignited a small, quiet awakening in every reader. Archer, isolated in his office, felt the awakening differently. The storm had taught him that influence was not simply about strategy or power. It was about perception, conscience, and human connection. He began to question routines he had long taken for granted. Reflecting on the ethical weight of decisions he had once considered mere transactions. And in that reflection, he discovered the quiet stirrings of personal change. Across America, ordinary citizens felt subtle shifts too. A father paused before correcting his child, wondering whether he was guiding or controlling. A manager reconsidered a policy that seemed convenient but unjust. A neighbor spoke up in a meeting, challenging assumptions previously left unquestioned. The awakening was not loud. It did not dominate headlines. It whispered through small acts of courage, reflection, and moral choice. Even institutions, once rigid, showed signs of transformation. Committees questioned procedures. Policies were revisited. And long-ignored gaps were addressed. The files had exposed not just scandal, but structural flaws. And awareness became the first tool of repair. MTG recognized this quietly. Her work had sparked controversy, yes. But its deeper impact was subtle. It was in the cautious recalibration of systems. In the private reflection of allies and adversaries. In the ethical vigilance of ordinary people. The cultural impact was equally understated. Media discussions became more nuanced. Social media debates, once dominated by outrage, shifted toward understanding, context, and accountability. Podcasts explored systemic ethics. Schools integrated discussions of morality and human consequence. Even entertainment began to reflect the awakening. Shows, music, and literature explored human choice, the fragility of trust, and the invisible forces shaping lives. Archer observed these shifts with a mix of awe and apprehension. He realized that influence, once exerted, cannot be contained. It moves through society like water through soil, invisible yet transformative. And while power can shape headlines, it is awareness that shapes culture. MTG, reflecting, understood that the quiet awakening carried responsibility. Change is fragile. Ethics are easily forgotten when convenience tempts. And so the work continues, not in rallies, speeches, or files, but in everyday acts of courage, awareness, and integrity. She recognized that lasting transformation emerges not from spectacle, but from consistent, deliberate reflection. In the hearts and minds of individuals, even the smallest actions contributed. A clerk corrected a procedural error. A teacher emphasized critical thinking over rote memorization. A citizen questioned a local policy. These acts, imperceptible alone, wove together into a collective awakening. A subtle reorientation of conscience and culture that could shape society over time. The storm had shown the fragility of systems, the consequences of secrecy, and the reach of human choice. But the awakening revealed something deeper. Awareness is contagious. Integrity is teachable. Courage, once demonstrated, inspires replication. And in this quiet awakening, the seeds of a more conscious society began to take root. The narrator's voice softens, reflective, cinematic. The storm moves through history, but the awakening moves through hearts. It whispers in classrooms, offices, and homes, reminding us that human choices matter. Even when no one is watching. Even when consequences are unseen. An awakening begins quietly, in each of us. The storm had revealed power. It had exposed ambition, secrecy, and systemic fragility. But now came the moment that no file, no headline, no public reckoning could deliver. The moment of choice. The moral crossroads. Archer found himself alone in his office late at night. The city stretched below him, a grid of lights and shadows. Alliances had shifted. Trust was fragile. And the files, once mere documents, had become mirrors. He faced a decision. To consolidate power at any cost. Or to act with conscience, even if it meant vulnerability. The temptation of influence was intoxicating. It whispered promises of control, prestige, and legacy. But conscience whispered louder. Every choice carries a human cost. Every action has consequences beyond the room. MTG faced her own crossroad. She had exposed truths, challenged power, and navigated alliances with precision. But every move left traces, small but consequential. Would she pursue advantage with ruthlessness? Or uphold a standard that honored human responsibility? Her advisors offered pragmatism. The crowd demanded spectacle. And yet, she paused. Because she understood a truth that power often obscures. The ethical path is rarely the easiest. But it is the one that endures. Even minor players felt the weight of crossroads. A journalist, poised to release a bombshell story, paused to consider. Will I chase clicks or integrity? Will I sensationalize or illuminate? The files had made one thing clear. Truth is not inert. It is alive. And the manner of its revelation can uplift or devastate. A clerk, once invisible, wrestled with conscience quietly. He had the power to suppress minor information. To stay within the comfort of bureaucratic neutrality. But his choices now carried significance. Would he act ethically? Even without recognition? Even without reward? He chose courage. Across the nation, citizens confronted moral crossroads of their own. A parent debated honesty with a child. A teacher considered fairness over convenience. A voter weighed conscience over party loyalty. The storm had not only exposed wrongdoing, it had illuminated human responsibility. The question was no longer, who holds power? The question was, who will act rightly when action matters most? Archer, reflecting, realized the paradox of power. It grants freedom to act. But it magnifies the weight of choice. Every maneuver, every alliance, every strategic victory was now tempered by ethical consequence. The files had taught him that influence without conscience is empty, hollow, fleeting. MTG confronted a similar paradox. Her influence had amplified her moral responsibility. Every exposure of truth, every challenge to power, was not merely political, it was human. She could choose ruthlessness. Or she could guide the storm's aftermath with awareness, ensuring that consequences were measured, and that harm was minimized without sacrificing truth. Even ordinary citizens experienced crossroads in subtle ways. A neighbor intervened in a local dispute. A student challenged a peer who cheated. A worker spoke up about an unsafe practice. The storm had revealed systems and failures. But the awakening revealed conscience. The recognition that every human decision matters. And that moral courage is rarely public, but always consequential. The narrator's voice grows quiet, intimate, cinematic. Every moral crossroads tests more than judgment. It tests courage. It tests conscience. It asks the question, what kind of person will you be when the storm has passed, and the consequences are yours alone to bear? The storm has ended, but the crossroads remain. And every choice defines who we become. The storm was over. The headlines faded. The files were archived. But life did not return to the same rhythm. It moved differently now, carrying a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. A change in how people thought, acted, and held one another accountable. In offices across the nation, small behaviors changed. Managers questioned old routines. Employees reconsidered silent compliance. Policies were reviewed not just for efficiency, but for ethics and human consequence. The ripple of awareness traveled quietly. From one person to another. From one decision to the next. Shaping a culture that was more conscious, more reflective, more human. Archer noticed it first in himself. Power still tempted him. But the seduction had softened. He paused before decisions. Considered the impact. Listened to conscience more than instinct. Even the act of thinking differently was a small revolution. The storm had taught him that influence is not enough. Human responsibility matters more. MTG, in her offices, observed similar transformations. Her team approached strategy with newfound consideration. Alliances were no longer purely tactical. They were ethical, deliberate, human. She realized that change does not arrive in grand gestures. It arrives quietly. Through repeated reflection. Through the reinforcement of conscience. And through the subtle cultivation of integrity. The cultural shift was subtle but undeniable. Communities debated accountability. Schools integrated discussions on ethics and transparency. Media explored systemic responsibility rather than sensationalism. Ordinary citizens found themselves questioning assumptions they had long taken for granted. They asked, how do my choices affect others? Am I complicit in silence? Am I acting ethically, even when convenience tempts me otherwise? The awakening was no longer just about politics. It was about humanity. Even the smallest acts carried meaning. A clerk ensured a record was accurate. A parent corrected an unfair lesson. A student returned a lost item instead of keeping it. Individually, these acts might seem minor. Together, they represented a subtle shift in behavior. A recalibration of conscience. A quiet redefinition of accountability. Archer, observing these societal ripples, understood the paradox of influence. Power can shape headlines. But awareness shapes culture. He realized that the storm had not just tested systems, it had tested humanity itself. And humanity, once awakened, begins to act. Even quietly, even subtly, even in ways unseen. MTG, reflecting, recognized that her work had lasting significance. Her exposure of hidden structures and ethical failures did not merely produce spectacle, it produced reflection. And reflection, sustained over time, produces transformation. The subtle shift was not immediate. It was slow, almost imperceptible. But persistent. It moved through people. Through institutions. Through culture itself. Even those untouched directly by the files felt the shift. Conversations became more nuanced. People listened more carefully. Communities valued transparency, integrity, and ethical courage. The storm had seeded a new awareness. And awareness, once planted, grows quietly but relentlessly. The narrator's voice softens, reflective, cinematic. The storm moves through headlines. But transformation moves through conscience. The files revealed systems. The leaks exposed ambition. And the storm tested human character. But the true legacy is the subtle shift in thought, behavior, and culture. The quiet awakening of responsibility. The slow, deliberate return to humanity. And change begins in the quietest moments. The storm had passed. Its headlines were archived. The files were stored in cabinets and servers. But its legacy, the human, moral, and cultural consequences, lingered. Archer, once consumed by power, now reflected differently. He understood that influence alone is fleeting. Legacy is measured not in victories, rallies, or headlines, but in the lives touched, the decisions weighed, and the conscience preserved. He thought about the people affected by his choices. Allies, rivals, bystanders, innocents. Each decision carried a weight he could no longer ignore. And he realized, the storm had not destroyed him, it had revealed him. MTG reflected too. Her actions had reshaped alliances, illuminated hidden structures, and prompted ethical reflection across society. But her greatest lesson was personal. Power carries responsibility beyond visibility. And truth carries consequences beyond intention. She had confronted deception, ambition, and corruption. She had exposed the machinery of influence. And through it, she understood something profound. Integrity is not rewarded by applause, it is measured in conscience. Ordinary citizens carried the storm's legacy in quiet ways. A teacher corrected biases in her curriculum. A student chose honesty over convenience. A clerk followed procedure not because it was mandatory, but because it was right. The storm had democratized accountability. It reminded people that every human choice matters. Even the smallest, even the unseen. The media ecosystem, once dominated by spectacle, adjusted subtly. Reporters considered long-term impact. Editors weighed ethical responsibility against sensationalism. Podcasts explored systemic ethics. Documentaries were created not to scandalize, but to illuminate. The files had changed journalism, not just in headlines, but in conscience. Institutions felt it too. Policies were revisited. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened. Cultural expectations shifted. The storm revealed fragility, yes. But it also revealed opportunity. The opportunity to build systems resilient not only to corruption, but to human fallibility. Archer understood, finally, the duality of legacy. Power can create. Power can destroy. But the lasting imprint is measured in how it shapes humanity. And so he chose, quietly, to act with reflection, humility, and responsibility. MTG realized that her legacy, too, was ethical. Her exposure of hidden systems had sparked debate, reflection, and subtle transformation. Her victories were not political, they were moral. And she understood, lasting change is not immediate. But it is inevitable when guided by conscience. Even in homes, offices, and classrooms, the storm's lessons endured. Conversations about ethics, integrity, and responsibility became more frequent. People questioned authority, not to rebel, but to understand. They reflected on choices, consequences, and courage. And in those reflections, the storm lived on, not as scandal, but as awakening. The files, the leaks, the storm, they had revealed the fragility of systems. They had revealed the seduction of power. But they had also revealed human potential. The capacity for reflection. The courage to act rightly. The subtle strength of conscience. Archer, MTG, and countless ordinary citizens shared one invisible legacy. The understanding that every human choice matters. The realization that ethics are active. That courage is quiet. And that morality is measured in action, not words. Even the smallest acts, speaking truth, correcting wrongs, standing firm, were part of a larger human mosaic. And over time, those mosaics built a culture more aware, more accountable, more human. The narrator's voice softens, reflective, cinematic. Storms pass. Files fade. Headlines are forgotten. But the lessons endure. The legacy of conscience, courage, and reflection is eternal. And the human spirit, tested by turmoil, emerges not diminished, but wiser, stronger, aware. And legacy lives in every choice we make. The storm had ended. The files were quiet. The city lights hummed softly, like a pulse beneath the night. But life never stops. It moves, relentless and human, carrying lessons, choices, and echoes of events long past. Archer stood by his office window, watching the streets below. He felt the weight of history, not headlines, not victories, but the invisible, enduring currents of human choice. He realized that influence is temporary. Consequence is eternal. And conscience, the quiet guide, cannot be silenced. MTG walked through corridors she had once navigated with strategy alone. Now, every step was measured with awareness. She knew the storm had exposed systems. But it had also exposed herself. The choice to act ethically, to illuminate truth, to guide with conscience, was the truest measure of power. Everywhere, ordinary lives reflected the same continuum. A teacher in a small town inspired critical thinking. A clerk ensured accuracy in unseen paperwork. A student returned honesty to a peer. A journalist told stories with conscience. These acts, quiet, invisible, human, formed a tapestry stronger than any headline, any scandal, any file. The storm, the files, the revelations, they were events. But humanity is a continuum. Decisions ripple. Actions echo. Ethics, once exercised, multiply. And society, shaped by these quiet choices, continues its rhythm. Resilient, aware, evolving. Archer reflected on this truth. The measure of a life is not in victories or survival, but in how one responds to the storms of history, to the challenges of conscience, to the responsibility of choice. The files had illuminated others, but ultimately, they illuminated him. MTG understood too. The storm was never about exposure alone. It was about awakening. Not the awakening of headlines, but the awakening of reflection, morality, and human responsibility. And that awakening cannot be legislated or orchestrated, it must be chosen. Across the nation, the lessons of the storm continued in classrooms, offices, homes, and public spaces. People spoke differently. They acted differently. And in the smallest of gestures, correcting, speaking truth, acting ethically, they contributed to the unbroken continuum of human conscience. Even systems and institutions absorbed the change. Oversight grew, policies were refined, procedures re-examined. But it was not bureaucracy alone that changed the world, it was human awareness. The storm had revealed that ethics is active. That courage is quiet. And that accountability begins in the human heart. The files, the leaks, the public spectacle, they all fade with time. But the lessons endure. Woven into the daily lives of those who witnessed. Those who reflected. And those who acted. The storm's true legacy is not exposure, it is the cultivation of conscience. Archer closed his eyes. He breathed deeply. And he understood, the human continuum moves forward. Ever aware, ever responsible. Never forgetting that every choice shapes the future. MTG, miles away, sat quietly in the late evening. She reflected on the storm, the files, and the choices made. Her responsibility, her conscience, her courage. All part of the unbroken chain that connects past, present, and future. The narrator's voice softens to a whisper, cinematic, intimate. The storm ends. But humanity continues. Every choice matters. Every conscience ripples outward. And the continuum of human responsibility never pauses, never stops, never forgets. Final echo line. And perhaps, that is how it all begins again.